Thanks, Jane. Great. So this is a meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. I pretty much know everybody usually, but my name's David Plum. If you're just joining us for the first time observing this council meeting, we've got an important meeting today. We have 3 hours and we're going to use it. We've got our sort of eyes on the prize today, which is, are we able as a council to get a set of draft priority recommendations in sufficiently decent shape that we're comfortable getting it out the door for public comment with all the caveats that we want to put on it, right? So that's our real goal for the day, is trying to do that. Let me put the agenda up and we can talk a little bit about how we're trying to work today. And we'll see how we do. Maybe someone could throw that agenda in the chat too, if they're able to do that handily. As always, our materials are online. We are updating the flashcards document to include a cross-cutting financing piece that didn't get included in the version. So stay tuned. That'll get updated. Jane, let me know when the version we just sent over is up on the web, and we'll let people know about that. All right. Let me know if this isn't big enough. Well, I'll make it a little bigger. I'll make it preemptively, I'll make it a little bigger. Okay. So our agenda today, as I said, the big eye in the prize here is, can we circle around and feel comfortable with caveat language in the draft priority actions we want to put out in the public space. As you all know, there's a number of public meetings and other opportunities scheduled in April to get input on this core material. This is our meeting to see if we can reach agreement on it. Jane's going to give an update on the technical modeling as well and where that stands. And we also have some thoughts about April. Currently, there's no council meeting schedules in April. We had assumed that councilors would be spending quite a bit of time helping accompany us in some of these public meetings. We do think there's going to be needs. We want to look at that. We talked to the steering committee about that. We have an idea for you. Okay, great. That's what we're trying to do. The way we're going to do it, as is usual, we're going to do a quick check-in on public comment that's come in. We're only scheduling 5 minutes for this because we don't have time to read through it in real time. But Sophie will give us an overview and point you to that document. If you haven't been looking at how that comes in, these are good opportunities to do that. Then we're going to start and spend the first almost hour focusing on the cross-sector mitigation stuff that we didn't look at in our March 10th meeting. And we know we've got some work to do in there. And so we're going to have to be efficient in how we laser in on the things that need attention from the transportation, buildings, and electricity stuff. Okay, then we're going to look at revisions that have happened to the stuff we did look at on March 10th, because a lot of thoughtful revision went in based on the punch list of things that you developed. We know we need to make a decision on the biomass thing, so we're going to do that as well. And as a council, do a little decision-making moment where you're comfortable landing on that. We'll take a break. We'll do some public comment. We aim to do public comment a little before 1 o'clock. And then our last bit is making sure we're comfortable with this package, with our caveat language and what's actually going out the door. And we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for Jane to do an update on the modeling. My only hesitation with this agenda is that in the cross-sector mitigation conversations, it may come up about the timing of the modeling. So Jane, it may end up being that we do a little in the moment discussion of modeling and when stuff is available. So thanks. If you're ready for that, that would be great. We have to, before we finish up today, let's just make sure we have a plan for April and any meetings we want to add. Okay. Any questions on our agenda or anything, Secretary Clark, that you were hoping to say before we get going?
No, thank you, David. I know today we have a lot to get through, so let's get started.
Great. Okay. All right. And councilors, anything before we get going? All right. Great. Okay. So the first thing is if Sophie, I can't tell who's in the room. Sophie, you there in the room? And hey, awesome. Do you want to share your screen? Do you want me to share the screen? Do we not want to share the screen? What would you like to do in terms of giving the update?
I think we don't need to share the screen. We got a lot of public comments between our last meeting and now. So welcome folks to read through those at your convenience. Those are posted, those were emails with your meeting materials. They're also linked in that calendar item. And thank you, David, for posting those in the chat. So if you want to pull them up to reference, go ahead. A lot of them touched on similar themes. So I'm going to read out loud one comment that a lot of other comments echoed. And just know that there were a lot of folks who wrote in expressing support for these items. So a lot of folks wrote in asking that the climate action plan be aligned with the Just Transitions principles developed by the Just Transition Subcommittee of the Climate Council, emphasizing that the solutions recommended by the Vermont Climate Council must be equitable. Some people are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than others. Additionally, we will need to ensure workers in the fossil fuel and biomass industries can meaningfully transition their jobs and continue to support their families as we move to clean energy. And then, as recommended by the science community and some members of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, there is support from many comments for biomass being eliminated as an energy source, and that new biomass electric should not be allowed. At a minimum, that the legislature should fund and undertake as soon as possible the study requested by the Climate Council in its biomass addendum regarding the implications of biomass as an energy source. And in the meantime, no approvals of new biomass on utility scale electric energy facilities. And then some comments included extending this to biofuels of any kind. There was also a lot of comments writing in with support for low emission local energy solutions. This includes weatherization, community solar and wind, and non-combustion thermal energy networks. Focusing that they're easy, low-cost solutions that must be made affordable and accessible to all Vermonters. Working through partners, the state, our utilities, and financial institutions, Vermont can proactively clear the path for successfully achieving renewable energy standard goals, 20% in-state renewable electricity, 20% from the region. In the electricity sphere, also emphasizing that electricity ratepayer protection for low and middle income Vermonters should be supported in order to ensure a just transition. There were also many comments that wrote in about the importance of investing in affordable, clean energy public transit systems. And these comments emphasized that, that there is a justice and equity component of public transit being accessible. And finally, there were many comments that specifically lifted up support for certain recommendations from the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Climate Council. Those recommendations that they lifted up with support included encouraging landowners and managers to implement practices that improve soil health, crop and forest resilience, increase carbon storage, increase stormwater storage capacity, and reduce runoff, using graded science and traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge, designed to represent diverse perspective and address a diverse audiences. Sustaining Vermont's carbon sinks and ecological resilience by protecting biodiversity, including all existing public land. There is support for allowing 9% of forests in Vermont to become old growth, stopping logging and extraction from public lands, increasing intact habitat and migratory corridors, ensuring a just transition for livelihoods related. And there are also comments about the use value appraisal programs connection with these. So a lot of comments that in summary, got at those various things. We also had sort of a suite of comments talking about the importance of state action in the broader context of climate action politically. And I'll just encourage folks to take a look at that if you haven't yet when you get a chance.
Thanks, Sophie. That's great. So yeah, it's all there. And such a good resource to have it summarized like that. Any council reflections before we move on to the next piece about what Sophie summarized there or what's in that document? And Sophie, it's correct to say that on the Climate Action Office's website, you can see all these comments as well as they come in. All these are publicly visible. Yeah. And so if you want to drop that link in the chat, again, that might be helpful just so people have that. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so we're going to do 2 blocks at a time now. The first is around the cross-sector mitigation issues. And as I mentioned in the March 11th or March 10th meeting, there had been a little snafu on how those were represented in the flashcards last time. So we've worked with the co-chairs and others to make sure we have the most updated versions. And frankly, in some of these, for instance, in Cap and Invest, where we had an additional set of information happen, the session we had with the experts a week or 2 ago, the treasurer's report, and those have factored in to some of these most recent versions. I thought it would be helpful to just walk through the flashcards quickly and have some tasks, the co-chairs and other folks who have been helpful in getting those words on the page and out of the Excel documents, just give a very quick overview. I do want to do a little reading time as usual. I also know that at least one counselor is coming prepared with some alternative language or suggestion. And so I want to get that on the table too. And then sit and do a little bit of thinking and reading, just a few minutes, and then have this discussion about things that we would really want to solve before these go out in their draft form. So I am happy to pull this up on my screen, and I think I'm just going to tap some folks to give some quick updates about the origin of this language and how it happened. I'm just going to start at the top of this document. By the way, this is the doc that's online right now. And Jane, can you let me know when there's an updated version?
It's being posted right now, so
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
up. This should be the, if you close this and re-click the link, it should be the right one then.
Let me do a little refresh here. And again, folks, the only thing that's changed is we didn't get that financing one. We'll get to that in just a moment. Okay. So, all right. So transportation is the top of the list here. I've been working with Joey and others to try to get this as accurate as possible from the Excel documents and what came from the subcommittee and what's been learned since then. Joey, can you just walk us through quickly sort of the origin of this and what's going on in this recommendation?
Sure. Well,
The 30-second version, sorry.
yeah, I mean, the origin really goes back to the 2021 adopted CAP, where we recommended a Cap and Invest policy, transportation climate initiative at that time to cover the transportation sector, knowing that we need a regulatory or policy approach or approaches to make certain and equitable, certain greenhouse gas emission reductions and equitable investments. And this, you know, we, through our transportation and addendums and through a carbon reduction strategy, deeper dive, and then climate policy analysis led by ANR VTrans in partnership with the treasurer and some members of a technical advisory committee, did a deeper dive. That policy just came out. We all went through it and got insights from 4 jurisdictions, 3 actually having implemented a program and 1 pursuing it, New York. So this is just sort of the latest incantation iteration of what we've been pointing towards for about 4 to 5 years now. And what it really does is say, continue to move forward, joining a Cap and Invest program to cover transportation and potentially other fuels, potentially thermal, for example, and is informed by two fundamental first steps. Well, one fundamental first step that we heard from those jurisdictions that we know is required before any potential program is set up, which would establish a reporting requirement of greenhouse gas emissions from fuel suppliers and to be determined other potentially obligated parties. So that's new, again, informed by the further analyses that have been undertaken and lived experience and implementation from other jurisdictions. And then also you'll see here another specific action related to authorizing the ANR or other potential state agencies in Vermont to collect revenue and distribute proceeds from any potential sale of allowances. And that's really what would be required, these two fundamental steps before any potential program is really fully implemented. So it's not like substantively different from where we've been and where we've been pointing to in the past, but with a little more specificity about specific action steps as a precursor to a potential program.
Thanks, Jerry. That's really helpful. And I think there's other pieces in this that will look familiar in this second priority action and the third priority action around public active and shared transportation. So there's other pieces here. What I want to scroll down to, and the electricity stuff is here as well. I want to scroll down quickly to buildings and thermal because, again, this connects to the cap and invest piece. And here, Rich and others, maybe you can help out. Again, this is like an and/or piece, and the and/or points to a similar recommendation around cap and invest. So Rich, can you just say a few words about how this syncs up with what Joey just described?
I think it syncs up quite well as it did last time. We need an overarching strategy to support and drive change in the thermal sector. And we've identified, as we have for, I think, consistently, a couple of overarching options. One would be to join a cap and invest program and have that program include the thermal sector. And the second would be to modify a performance standard like the Clean Heat Standard, and to do so in a way that Vermont could do on its own. And we could ensure that the implementation of a Clean Heat Standard proceeds at a pace that is moderate and where a cost cap can be built into it from the outset.
Excellent. Okay. So these are two biggies that talk to each other, right? From a cap and invest standpoint, and then the buildings and thermal has this sort of and/or component around a modified clean heat standard. Okay. Kelly, happy to do quick clarifying questions.
Real quick. I see this asterisks in the top part. I'm not sure if the thing they point to is in this document somewhere, but I didn't see it.
Yeah, these two bullets used to be asterisk 1 and asterisk double asterisk. It got a little squirrely in the thingy, so we can just take these away and let these bullets stay, talk for themselves.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a formatting issue. Matt?
Yeah, could you go back a couple slides where it talks about fuel dealers reporting?
This one.
Yeah, as a first step, require reporting of greenhouse gas emissions data from fuel suppliers. Is the intent of this for dealers to do the calculation and self-report?
I don't know. Joey and others who are involved in this, I think we're about to have a conversation about this as well. And I think Secretary Moore has some other ways of looking at this that may get at what you're asking, Matt.
Okay, thank you.
Jared?
I'd be happy to hear from others, but my sense is that what is most important from fuel suppliers is the volumes of fuel sold, and then emissions factors get applied by state agencies. So I think it's the data underlying how to calculate greenhouse gas emissions, but the important thing is the fuels reporting in support of greenhouse gas, a reporting requirement to enable a fuller accounting in those sectors. So there's a relationship, but I think that the fuels piece is the most important.
Thanks, Jared. Helpful. Michelle?
I just wanted to mention on the other slide from the heating sector, there were some acronyms that were not spelled out. And I think
Ugh.
it's important to do that slide by slide, just because our audience may be sort of coming in and out of paying attention to what's going on. And it's just a lot of acronyms to remember. And then secondly, I guess, given the fact that this is, a 5-year plan, I would be somewhat concerned that we limit our investigation of potential cap and invest programs to specifically New York and the Western Climate Initiative. What if there were another framework to come forth? So I just question that.
Thanks, Michelle. So here's what I think, folks. This issue of the cap and invest is very central to these recommendations. It's kind of like a cornerstone piece as it's been put forward. It's how the subcommittees were thinking about it, how the previous action plan, in the initial climate action plan, thought about it. I think it might be worthwhile spending a little time on this, and then we can have a pause and think about anything else we need to talk about. One thing I know, Secretary Moore, you had some concerns about how this language shows up, and you had a different take on it. And I'm wondering if this might be a good time for you to describe that.
Helpful. I can also share my screen so folks can see words while we have the conversation. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. Do you have the power to do that?
I believe I do.
Yep, there you go. It's
Okay.
working.
Great. So, I kind of appreciating the intent, but trying to get a
Make
little
that
bit more.
bigger. Sorry, it's impossible to see. Thanks.
Okay. I think that's about as big as I can make it before we'll start to lose words off the screen.
Thank you.
So, appreciating what I understand to be the intent about sort of taking those foundational steps that would be necessary for possible future participation in a cap and invest program. Tried to get more specific in both thinking about the fact that there are already some existing reporting requirements and just layering another set of reporting requirements on, which is, I think, the practical effect of the words on the page, since this ANR is the only one who can be directed by the council to adopt rules. And there's other things that already exist, trying to make clear that the intention here is for streamlined reporting requirements. Then the next piece is really building on some of the recommendations from the treasurer's report related to cap and invest, and specifically that it's important to think ahead about the affordability concerns related to a cap and invest program, and some of the study that would be required in terms of how dividends would be distributed, whether allowances from sales would be used for low carbon technologies versus reducing costs to low income Vermonters, and setting limits on allowance prices, which I know shows up in the second kind of related recommendation in the building and thermal space. And then, the idea that we would continue to monitor the work being done in other jurisdictions with regular updates being provided to the council. But I do think, sort of the level of granularity here is important. And frankly, I think we would be remiss in not being explicit about our commitment to thinking carefully about the impacts this program could have on low and moderate income households.
Thanks, Julie. So me reading this right now, what I see, what's different here is what Julie described, right? Is, a different way of saying like adopt a rule, right? It's saying ANR will develop a framework for reporting. And then it ties into the other pieces of the treasurer's analysis, which was, hey, think now about how this plays out in different households and the affordability issues. So those seem like significant changes that this does. And Secretary Moore, obviously feel free to correct me. So
Yeah,
I
I
think,
think that just on that first one, David, I mean, if it is anticipating this would build towards a rule that ANR would enact, but I think there are some other changes to statute that have to go along with that. Otherwise, we're just placing multiple reporting requirements on the same entities that is sort of contrary to good government. So the idea being we would come up with what that reporting requirement would look like and bring it to the legislature for action next session. To both repeal some of those existing requirements or adjust some of those existing requirements and put in place a framework that would meet the intent of a cap and invest program.
great. Thank you. Very helpful. I'm curious, counselors, any questions for Secretary Moore and what's being proposed here is somewhat different language? Any questions? Jared?
Sorry, just a clarifying question. David, do you want just questions at this point, or do you want reactions and comments? I have more of the latter, so I'm happy to defer if others have questions.
I'd go for questions right now, and then let's do some reactions. Thanks, Jared. Rich?
Yeah, I have a question. I like a lot of this, but I'm concerned that there is such a focus on using proceeds from allowance sales to deal with the equity question, which we know is essential. And other programs have been able to accomplish equitable results using about half the money that way. And this recommendation doesn't mention anything about investing the proceeds in order to reduce emissions and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels over the long term. And my question is that left out, for a reason that you care to explain?
The second sub-bullet, it maybe is inelegant, but it was meant to get at that, Rich. The first bullet was really about just returning sort of a dividend that reflects the increased cost to low and moderate income households. And the second is then making those incentives in either energy efficiency or the adoption of low carbon technologies, so heat pumps. If you have better words for that, I'm all ears, but it was intended to sort of get at both of those items, knowing that those are two different components of how the proceeds can get used.
Thank you for the explanation. And I guess I would only recommend that to some degree, incentives will be needed in other households aside from the LMI, but how they're invested will be an important component of program design when we get there. But thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Chris?
Yeah, I guess apologies if we talked about this over the years and I've just have forgotten. But one of the things that occurred to me based on Rich's question about the equity and justice concerns, and then also the investment of money to facilitate kind of more structural change. Have we looked at low to moderate income? I'm answering a question in the chat. The scalability of other states, province experiences relative to Vermont, to kind of a sense of what kind of percentages and all we might be able to actually be, what we're kind of looking at, like our population of 620,000 relative to the size of the states and provinces that are also doing this. Because I'm interested in Rich's question and Julie and Secretary Moore's response, but it occurs to me I just hadn't really thought about what it looks like in terms of Vermont scale relative to the other precedent-setting jurisdictions.
Scale, Chris, in terms of the amount of revenue we would expect to generate through a cap and invest? Or I guess I'm not sure what you mean in terms of.
Yeah,
scale.
yeah, exactly. How relative to like the cost of the, and we may not have an answer to this, but yeah, I was thinking like, the cost of the providing the aid to the low to moderate income households and investing in technologies and other things to kind of help us with make more of the structural changes. What will that look like for a state of 620,000 relative to these larger jurisdictions? I just don't know how much is the anticipation, and there may not be an answer to this. I'm just throwing this as why it's a question. Do we have a sense of that? Have we already talked about that in years past? Or do we think? Yeah. Anyway, that's yeah.
I think a lot of that information exists in the Cambridge Systematics report. They went through and sort of showed revenue generation potential at low, moderate, and high sort of cap and invest price ceilings, and then did a bunch of different analyses looking at how that would impact a variety of households based on different rebates, I guess, as opposed to dividends that could be provided.
Yeah. So that study, which maybe someone can throw in the chat, has a table in it that sort of does that work, Chris. So it's in there. We can poke around at it, but like all things, it's variable, right? But yeah, that was part of the work of that study. Joey, I don't want to forget about Jared as well.
Or Rich, did you have a direct answer to that? I see you came off mute.
Yeah, my direct answer to Chris's question is that looking at these programs in a variety of places, basically it's proportional. The revenue raised tends to be proportional, and the opportunities to invest the revenue tend to be proportional. And as just noted, the studies done for Vermont have actually examined this in some detail. There have been numerous studies in Vermont demonstrating the benefits of greatly enhanced weatherization programs, for example. And the Vermont revenues are Vermont-sized revenues, and the Vermont housing stock is a Vermont-sized housing stock. So the proportionality holds.
Thanks, Rich. Okay. Joey?
Yep, thanks. My original question related to what Rich had asked about, and that Secretary Moore, I think, clarified in bullet number 2. I mean, I think there's a lot of good stuff in here. I appreciate you putting it forward. I would have welcomed the opportunity to see it before today, because I think there's good stuff here. And I'm just curious, like, I think the point that Rich raised, and I'd love to clarify, I fundamentally view this as important to raise a sustainable revenue source for some of the investments that we know we need to make and that Vermonters want to make, and importantly, wanting to make sure you design a program that does mitigate negative impacts to low to moderate income Vermonters. I think it's possible, and I think this work could be really useful. My question is more, I guess, at this point, sort of a process point. Are we going to wordsmith some of this language today, David, in terms of putting it out to the public? Because I want to think about that a little bit more, just to make sure that it all sort of adds up to what we have recommended in terms of pursuing a program and actually moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. Yeah, the goal is to make some decision about what language version or versions go out to public comment and make that decision today. And indeed, it's tough. The timing, the materials got posted late last week, and Secretary Moore pulled this together this morning. So we're all working quickly here. So I think the goal is to agree on some language, at least from a draft standpoint, that can go out today with all the caveats we want to put on top of it. Peter?
Hi, thanks. I have a hard time processing all of this. This is stuff that's not in my area of expertise, so I'm reluctant to jump and try to do something on the fly like this. I think it's challenging. I mean, I understand we have timelines, but this is brand new language to me that gotta admit, I don't really understand the implications of all aspects of this. So if there was a way we could take a little more time, that might be helpful.
Okay, thanks. Let's see what we can do there. Jared?
Thanks, David. So overall, I think that I appreciate a lot of the content in this language because I think it really helpfully identifies two of the key next steps in terms of the reporting requirement and in terms of the mechanisms, both for direct rebates and for kind of equity and pollution reducing focused incentives. And so where I'm at is I would be comfortable with this as additional clarifying language around some of the key next steps, but I'm not comfortable with it as replacement language for what we already have for two reasons. One is this plan is meant to cover the next 4 years and meet our legal obligation to put forward a plan that can add up to meeting our commitments around a range of issues, but including emissions reduction in a cost-effective and equitable way. And we know that a number of these programs may be moving forward, and there may be opportunities to join and begin within that next 4-year period. So I wouldn't be comfortable with language that just talks about making possible future participation when we could be in a period when that participation could be real and beneficial. So that would be my suggestion, especially where we're at in the process of gathering public input, would be to add this language as some greater specificity on some of the next steps related to exploring and preparing for Cap and Invest, but not to have it replace the very carefully and well-considered language that was developed over a matter of months between task groups and subcommittee members. So hopefully that allows, multiple perspectives to get feedback and proceed, and then we can do work to integrate or kind of harmonize these as we go later. But that's kind of my feeling, is that this is helpful additional clarifying information on next steps, but cannot and should not replace the underlying recommendation.
Jared, can I ask a clarifying question of what you just said? Because I want to make sure I understand what the underlying recommendation is that language you're wanting to defend.
Mm-hmm.
Is it like the one sentence that says join a Cap and Invest?
It's what was shared on the slides previously, the recommendations that were lifted up to the council and in the materials that were shared.
Right.
It's
I want to be clear because
administrative action. We have to have an evidence-based plan with recommendations that can add up to meeting our legal commitments. And I think all of the studies and evidence we've looked at has shown that we can't have any confidence that we'd be able to do that without an affirmative recommendation around either a Cap and Invest program or a performance standard. Now, there's certainly questions about how those are, the final design and some of the design questions of them, but the underlying basic recommendation of having those two options on the table to move forward through legislative and administrative action, and clearly that'll end up being a debate in those forums. But I think that we need to put forward a plan that has those as actual strategies rather than future possibilities.
Got it. So just to be clear, the language that's important to you here is this language of through legislation and administrative action, join a Cap and Invest program. That's what you're looking to maintain.
As our recommendation, yes.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Can I
Dalia? Oh, wait, yeah.
just one piece of reaction, because I think this is going to come up in sort of comments and concerns I've had throughout. I would say between the PUC's work on the clean heat standard and the more recent work by the treasurer around Cap and Invest, I don't think there is a strategy that gets us to 2030. And I think at some point we've got to own that. And we're a little bit in both spaces in the way the plan and some of these recommendations are drafted, where we sort of give a nod to affordability and yet also 2030. And I understand what Jared's saying, that is the Global Warming Solutions Act is has the council producing a plan theoretically sufficient to meet 2030. I'm not sure that such a plan could be made, but then we should have an overarching statement about the concerns related to the impacts achieving those deadlines will have on low and moderate income Vermonters, as there's been no evidence presented in the myriad of different technical studies we've done that we can achieve 2030 and do it in a way that avoids those impacts to the most vulnerable. And so I'll raise those again, but that I am uncomfortable suggesting we can do both at this point because none of our work has indicated that that's possible.
Okay. And I know Jared raised his hand to react to that. I've got a couple other hands up as well. Jared, I'll just give you like a quick reaction on that, and then I want to grow up Dahlia, and then Kelly, and then Sarah.
I'm happy to defer to others. So I'll just say very quickly, I disagree with the characterization that Secretary Moore made, and I'm happy to dig into that further later if and as we have time.
Thanks, Jared. Dahlia?
Yeah, I would just say that I understand that timeliness and kind of deliberate implementation is a delicate balance. I would just advocate for using some language regarding cap and invest that communicates urgency and maybe a clearer timeline. Just because in sitting and listening in the last meeting to all of the other states and their experiences with the cap and invest program, I was listening to, I think it was California, and they said they got their plan up and running in 2007, which is when I was born. And so that's a really long time for this program to happen. And then on the other hand, there's Washington, and I believe it was Luke who was given, I think, a year, 2 years to implement this plan. And I think he did it pretty effectively. Of course, there were some flaws, but I think just using clear, urgent language would be really beneficial.
Thanks, Dahlia. Okay. Kelly?
I think a lot of what Jared said resonates with me, and I put this in the chat, but I think what was written on the slides by the transportation cross-sector mitigation, I think it's important to do this, but then the next steps that Secretary Moore outlined, I think are really important. And that's where, so this felt like the overarching thing. And then I hope every single one of these overarching, highlight priority actions we're putting out there are going to have more details in our final version of the climate action plan. If not, we're not writing a very good plan. But right now we need feedback on the high level thing, and then members of the public can have a chance to weigh in and say, well, if you're going to do this, you have to have these, further actions that you're going to do to implement this. And so that's where I think Secretary Moore's outline gets us really close to how we would pursue the next steps and make sure that if we're doing this, we're both reducing emissions and prioritizing equity. And even if we're not going to hit our 2030 target, it still seems smart to join a cap and invest program and do it really equitably so that low income and other marginalized Vermonters are not negatively impacted. I think we think we can do both. Maybe we won't hit 2030, but we shouldn't be like, well, we're not going to hit this one thing that's in statute, so we shouldn't try to reduce emissions at all, because we might not hit that target. I think we can do it equitably, and we should be reducing emissions, period. We're emitting too much, right? And based on what the reports the report from the consultants and what we heard from the other states, I think there is a way to do it equitably and continue to reduce emissions.
Thanks, Kelly. And so what I'm hearing you say is somewhat, trying to do what Jared was doing, where you give a statement that's clear about the directionality of what we're doing. Like we should do this. This is what it looks like to do this in practice. And that's kind of like what Julie's language is. Yeah. Okay. Secretary Clark?
I think the option that Secretary Moore laid out on the screen earlier really pivots the state operationally to position us when and if the time is right to join a Cap and Invest program. And I say that based on my understanding of the report that the Treasurer's Office provided in terms of what's feasible for Vermont and what makes sense for Vermont. So I view the language provided by Julie as what we can actually do as a state to get us ready for a Cap and Invest program, and that those are necessary steps to do before.
Thanks, Secretary Clark. And I'm curious your reaction and Julie's reaction of some mashup that takes a headline sentence that's similar to what came out of the subgroups, the subcommittees. It's like through administrative and legislative action. I don't have it in front of me. Join a Cap and Invest program, and then takes Julie's language and pastes it in there to say, this is what it looks like to take the steps to move in that direction. So I want to put that out there and think about that for a second. Joey?
And I'm interested in a mashup and following up on Jared and Kelly's recommendation. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I would have concerns about just continuing. I think there's some really good content in here and love to build on it. But I hesitate to like, if punt again. I think we need to be clear that like we need to move forward. We're not going to make progress and raise sustainable revenue unless we have some sort of program like this. There's further work to do. It sounds like the treasurer's committed. I think there's work to do in that vein. And it may or may not add up, even if it's a recommendation to achieving 2030, but it is intended to do this as quickly and as equitably as possible. I mean, we're studying this in the Transportation and Climate Initiative for well over a decade. I mean, at some point we got to move forward, and this is what I think it will take. And so I'd like to have a conversation about mushing some of this good stuff together.
Thanks. That's helpful. Rich?
Yeah, I just want to chime in to echo what Kelly said. I think realistically pointing out whether or not 2030 is the 2030 goals are immediately achievable or not is a little bit beside the point when what we're talking about is the urgency of getting going. And so the language, the active language about we should join a Cap and Invest program or create an equivalent program for Vermont seems to me to be essential. In other words, not just monitor, not just study for another umpteen years, but take some action. And the same thing is true with respect to reporting. Anybody who's working on any of these programs will tell you that the foundation that you need is a good reporting foundation. And I appreciate Secretary Moore's statement that her intention is with this language to adopt a rule that would establish a good reporting system for Vermont. But the language as written doesn't really make that quite clear enough. And the process that we might want to go through to adopt a rule, might have different steps in it, but the goal is get a reporting rule in place. I think that's.
Thanks, Rich. And again, I'm in my mind, and I recognize Peter Sterling's comment and others of like, wow, this is hard to do in real time. However, we are at a place where I think because you're putting out draft text and because there will be a caveat language, you actually are in a place where you may be able to work in real time and reach some agreement today about what's good enough with the caveat to go out as a draft. Jared, and then Julie.
Thanks. I just want to offer an observation about timing that I think is really important here, because I heard you, Secretary Clark, say what the recommendations were in the treasurer's report. And I'll just say that as I read that, I was reading it as, what do we know now? And there was an interest between the options studied in terms of Western Climate Initiative or New York's program. There, I read and heard greater interest in the possibility of New York because of a bordering state and expected lower starting allowance price and the ability to deal with some of the leakage issues. But my understanding is that report was looking at what do we know right now, whereas what my read is our recommendations in the climate action plan need to be in place for what we do as a state over the next 4 years. And it's entirely possible that New York has a program to join in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And I think we would need a recommendation that is on the table to enable that. And it's also possible that given the report from the consulting team on Cap and Invest, and this is where I would disagree with the characterization that Secretary Moore put forward, is that we know that there are ways that we can reduce emissions while also reducing costs for lower and middle income Vermonters. There was a scenario with 50% of the revenue proceeds going back to direct rebates and having low and middle income Vermonters not just held whole, but coming out $500 to $700 ahead as part of a larger suite of programs to meet our overall commitments. So I'm just, I think we need to be careful about being aware of the different timelines that are being analyzed. And I don't think we want to say just because something is not ready right now that we wouldn't want to make a recommendation that we would need over the next 4 years, and recognize the full range of possibilities to do this affordably and equitably, which we know from evidence from other states and the analysis and research that's been done is more than possible. So that's what I would offer. And I'd go back to the original recommendation of let's advance for public feedback the recommendation that was put forward by the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee with Secretary Moore's language as additional specificity on some of the next steps that could be taken in support of that.
Thanks, Jared. And Julie, over to you, and then I'm gonna try to show something on my screen that looks like a mashup and see how this works. But Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was also going to offer a friendly amendment to my own, which is closer to the version of the language put forward by cross-sector mitigation, but which would say enable, through legislation and administrative action, Vermont to be ready to join a Cap and Invest program or something along those lines. Like, to me, the challenge here is the directive join, when we haven't done the homework yet. And I feel like this is sort of the way, part of where things fell apart with the clean heat standard is I don't see the clean heat standard as fundamentally broken. I see it as we asked it to do something it was incapable of, and yet designed the whole thing soup to nuts without benefit of doing that groundwork. And what I'm saying in my recommendations is the groundwork I believe is needed to ensure that this can ultimately be done successfully is a thoughtful rule around reporting that doesn't duplicate existing requirements. And Rich, take your point seriously, a rule is needed, but if the plan says rule, I have to enact a rule within 12 months, and it doesn't give time for undoing some of what already exists to have one set of reporting obligations for these entities. And I do think the low and moderate income program design, I agree, Jared, the Cap and Invest report shows that it's possible, but there's a lot of work translating that into a functional reality, and not acknowledging that and having that be a step before we decide whether or not to join a Cap and Invest, I think is a mistake, because we need to be able to be certain we've put in place a framework that'll support folks who can least afford to make this transition on their own. So I guess if something can be done to soften that first sentence, I appreciate the idea of tucking it in there. I urge you all to be cautious about directing the adoption of a rule because it starts a clock. And it's a clock that doesn't sit well with the legislative cycle. And so to the extent the legislature has to do anything, we don't have time to wait for that action.
Okay. I wonder if we could, in the spirit of just trying to put something out for public comment that gets as close as possible to what collectively you're comfortable with, we could do some kind of mashup here. And let me share my screen. And typically when you do something like this, nobody's all that happy, but perhaps we're equally happy and unhappy. And let's see how that goes. You know, for instance, what if you keep the language as it is, where through join, right, the directive that makes Julie uncomfortable, but you put a little clause, once necessary preparatory steps are taken or something like that, right? And then you talk about the preparation that's needed. In preparation for joining, take necessary supporting steps, including, and then this is what Secretary Moore's language was, right? Develop the framework, collaboration, public service, do all this work, right? Continue to monitor, right? So you've got a fairly clear message of go in this direction, right? And there's a message of preparations needed. This is the preparation that would be needed. All right. So just in the spirit, and again, I pasted this above. This is an overarching caveat that you all agreed to last time that would go on every page of the draft that you put out there. So I just want to remind everyone that this would be a caveat that says, you know, the council continues to debate these potential actions, seeks public input on them. They do not yet reflect a final decision by the councilors who have a range of views on them. Rich?
Okay. Thanks for trying. I feel that there is a solution in here, but I want to just suggest one additional change. And that is if you scroll down about how revenues would be, the second bullet, distributing dividends is important. The second one is using the proceeds. It's limited to low LMI households.
Right. So you'd want to put something else in here.
Well, I might just say direct incentives, you know, to support increasing energy efficiency and the adoption of low carbon technologies, particularly those that benefit low income households. I'm thinking of things like, you know, building out the electric vehicle charging stations. You know, we need to do it. And this is a way the revenues could be spent, but
got it.
You know, they're not targeted to those particular households. And not only that, but there's lots of other programs that are, you know, more broadly applicable. But
thanks, Rich. That's really helpful. And I hope everyone saw what I just did there to address Rich's concern on this. Again, it's very hard to do this real time and editing like this, but I'm just curious if we can get there. We'll give it a little time. Joey?
Appreciate what you're trying to cobble together here, David, and I'm optimistic we can get there. I had a couple of other thoughts on potential small changes. On that bullet, first of all, that you're on, I wondered if we just might want to reference reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Use proceeds from allowance to provide direct incentives to support reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I just think that seems, you know, as well as providing direct incentives to LMI.
I was intentional in not saying that, Joey, because weatherization isn't going to rank if it's specifically around reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I guess if you want to add it to the list, I think that that's fine, but I don't think it should replace increasing energy efficiency because that gets at, to me, that is intended to get at weatherization.
I mean, that's fair. I think it should certainly be in the mix of what, so I would add it to that mix. I also wonder, that would be important to me. I wonder in terms of the A&R will develop a framework for reporting, in the first paragraph after your addition, needed to support streamlined reporting requirements and maybe a stepped implementation plan. I guess like wanting A&R to provide guidance with like, how do we actually move forward with exploration of a program that could serve Vermonters well, as we've heard from other jurisdictions are serving them well. So that would be one other addition. And then on the A&R in collaboration with the Public Service Department, VTrans, I would recommend adding either the Climate Council or specific members of the Climate Council. I feel like if this is an effort to achieve the Climate Action Plan, it feels important to add representation from the Climate Council.
Okay, thanks. And Joey, I didn't catch on this one. I was switching the language so we could do this, but changes need to support streamlined reporting requirements. You said a stepwise implementation plan?
Yes. A stepped implementation plan.
Okay, great. Rich, and then I want to circle back to
and just my other
yeah,
request for adding the Climate Council or members of, I just feel like it is a shared endeavor.
okay, great. Rich, and then Julie, and then I want to stop this little exercise and see how we're doing. You're on mute, Rich.
I messed up in both ways. That was a legacy hand and I was on mute.
Okay, great, super. Secretary Moore, you've seen a little bit of typing I've done in this, and others that share some of your concerns. Are you comfortable in sort of how we're getting to a place of just draft text here?
Yeah, I mean, I think recognizing where we're at and the need, that the next step is to go out for public comment. I think I can be okay with this for right now. I do continue to worry, just we have some very specific words and directives that come with the Global Warming Solutions Act, and want to be mindful of that. And I think I remain concerned that saying or indicating we're going to join an uncap and invest program without having done these supporting steps feels like we're getting ahead of ourselves, and would feel better if we had some pause and reconsideration. You know, the Climate Council has done addendums before. I think there's a way to structure this that we don't have to say, this is our path forward. Particularly, and it'll come up again when we get to the sort of A and B options in the buildings and thermal section. Like at some point we need to sort of dig deep into an approach and make sure it's workable. And I guess I would offer in sort of the commitments laid out here, I'm really uncomfortable suggesting a clean heat standard is still in play, that this reflects a significant amount of work on the part of the agency. And I think we have to pick a path and do the groundwork and then make a decision.
Okay. And Julie, just to be clear, in terms of what goes out for as a draft for public comment, are you comfortable, for instance, with, you know, even with all your reservations about the clean heat standard or modified clean heat standard, is that okay to go out and talk to folks about with as sort of and or language like we have now?
Somehow we've got to connect this cap and invest with that cap and invest. And I don't think I think I appreciate we've done these by sector, right? We've done transportation versus building and thermal. I don't think that organizational strategy necessarily makes sense in engaging the public about this. I think we would need to make clear, if folks are saying yes to a clean heat standard, then they would be saying we want I assume they would be saying maybe yes to a cap and invest program, but it would be transportation specific. And we got very clear feedback from our consultants about the viability or the impact of a transportation only cap and invest program. Like I think we have to give a little bit more structure to what we're asking the public for feedback on these two big recommendations. And I guess I'm not all the way there yet. I think these words on the page are fine, but that I'm not necessarily fine if we don't do something a bit different with what's in the buildings and thermal space.
Thanks, Julie. Jael?
Yeah, I guess I'm just wanting a little more clarity around the conducting the technical study. Because there's language about doing a study around biomass and that still hasn't happened. So, some sort of deadline or something will advance a technical study. How many years is that technical study going to take before we join? Things like that. It could drag on for years and years.
David, if I could, I
Yeah.
think somewhere in here, we've got to be mindful of the fact that state agencies have budgets, and to the extent the council isn't advocating for the resources to do this work, we don't necessarily, or in that instance, don't have the resources to do the work. It's not that we wouldn't have moved forward a biomass study, it's that the resources haven't been provided to us to support that study. And so there's a council responsibility in here too, to the extent that we are identifying, and I think that'll come up in some other places where I know there are a couple of recommendations with very specific deadlines and some questions about resources being available. But somehow we can't, I get put in this hard position of being given assignments without the resources necessary to fulfill the assignments.
Yeah. Okay. Chris?
Sorry. So we can put a pin in this, but the messaging around asking for budgets to support this work I think it's been complex over time. I know that direction has been given. I think the administration personnel here that, got to stick within the governor's budget, and then the planning council members, the climate council members who are not members of the administration, we need to be able to come up with what a recommendation might be that maybe conflicts with the governor's budget. So if we could we can put a pin in this, but if we can come up with a formal process by which we actually do this, that would be fantastic, because I think it'd be great to ask for what's actually needed to support the work of the council and the development of future iterations of the climate action plan and the implementation thereof. But that needs to be intentional and not kind of off the cuff. So, yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's been a process. I remember years past with that. Definitely can put a pin in that. Carrick?
Maybe it's another pin, not sure. I just
Okay.
want to, just so long as there's been back and forth, I'm aware, from Melissa Bailey, from my team and the like, and talking to Jules and others. Whatever the mechanism, it's the concept that there has to be resources associated with the ask, because we're dealing with this. The reason why it's sensitive, reason why I wanted to weigh in, it's something that we're confronting at the State House right now, with additional asks, plus federal asks, plus potential removal of funds through tariffs and other federal dysfunction. So this is a particularly acute issue. So I'm just asking, and Chris, I like the way you kind of laid that out. The point is, at least the concept that there has to be resources wherever that comes from, because that has, at least I'm told, that has been controversial, and it should not be. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay, great. So here's what I'm thinking, folks. It feels like we're getting close to language that, you all have some changes to, and Jared, I took what you said, put in the chat, and made that an updated for the final bullet, as long as folks are fine with that. So I think we're getting preciously close. I think I want to take up one of the last things that was said is like, how do we, for the public, make sense of this for the connection between the buildings and thermal and the transportation? And I wanted to test with you all how you could actually write something that's sort of cross-sector, like above it all, right? A cap and invest recommendation. And then in the buildings and thermal, if you want to keep the and or, you reference back to the cap and invest when you said that's one of your two options. So I'm just curious, folks feel comfortable with that, like lifting it up above transportation or in buildings, just say, this is our sort of overall view on cap and invest. And when you get to the buildings, it's like, so you could do a modified clean heat standard and or this. Jared, how's that feel?
Thanks, David. I'm generally comfortable with that. I guess I just want to share that I may have a different view of the responsibility of the council than others, but my sense is that our responsibility is to identify the options that can advance our legal commitments across the Solutions Act. And so, but I think the policy reality is that there's multiple options that can do that. And so, you know, I would rather say to the political decision makers, to the administration, to the legislature who are going to have to make these final decisions, there are multiple paths forward here. We could do a multi-sector cap and invest. There's also a path around performance standards, and they're not mutually exclusive. But to me, I would feel uncomfortable with pushing the council to make a political determination about the exact path that should be taken, rather than saying, here are the obligations we've been given. We know of two policy pathways that can achieve it, and it's your opportunity to choose. Otherwise, I feel like it gets too prescriptive, or we leave possible paths off the table. So
Thanks, Jared. Yeah.
I-
Julie?
I think that's fine, but that sort of runs contrary to the words on the page currently, which says joint, right? Like, I appreciate what you're saying, David. I think the need for an overarching statement, and I'm happy for more public input and feedback on which of these approaches make sense. But I think we need words on the page then that reflect that we're asking for people for that kind of input and advice. And our recommendation isn't to join a cap and invest and implement a modified clean heat standard, right? That this is a place where we're specifically asking for input. And in some ways, you know, the language in 7 might do that a little bit more nicely, adopt one or more sector-wide policies. And if that's sort of the banner these fit under, and then we're asking for advice and input, great. But I think going out with something that says join doesn't connotate that we're asking people to weigh in on two different alternatives.
Yeah, and I think what may be happening there, Secretary Moore, is like for the transportation sector, it is what I'm hearing from folks is that is kind of the path, and how you do it is up for debate and all that. But it is the path. Whereas in buildings, they're saying, hey, one or more of these policy options. So I think that's maybe the nuance. I'm curious for folks if we were to lift this up and make it sort of standing above, and then when you get to the building specific things, you do the either or language, and then you point back to it for the detail of it. If folks would be comfortable doing something like that as just a way to have it make sense, you know, sitting above transportation and buildings and everything. Is there any concerns with doing something like that? Rich?
Well, I defer to Joey and the transportation team if they have a problem with that, but my quick reaction is that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. And I think to do that, you would do a minor adjustment of that first sentence where we had a bunch of parentheses, and take that parentheses and say, you know, join blah, 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 covering emissions from Vermont's transportation fuel sector and potentially other sectors once necessary preparation steps are taken. Okay. All right, so I want to take a pause on Cap and Invest, because we're going to circle back at the end of the meeting. I give folks just a moment to breathe through it. I will put this thing up, and maybe we can even post it online, so we can just sit with it for a little bit over a break and things like that. I'd like to step back for a moment and say, within cross-sector mitigation, thanks, Jane, I'll do that. Are there other things that folks want to bring up? I know there's at least one more, because I've heard from folks over the weekend about this. And that is, we slipped in, there used to be X's in the weatherization numbers. And with some email communication with Rich and others over the weekend, or last week, we put a number in where that X was. And that number is causing some consternation. So that's on my punch list right now of something to deal with. Are there other things in the cross sector that folks want to deal with that are important to name right now? Michelle?
I just wanted to revisit the priorities for the transportation sector. I'm the second priority framework. I feel like the language is fairly vague in terms of trying to get to specific actions. And we have already done a lot of research that indicates the number of EV charging stations we need, the number of monies we need for incentives based on the work we did for the EPA grant, the CPRG grant. And so in terms of trying to make the plan more actionable, I think it would be helpful to clarify with specifics. I think that also helps Vermonters understand the magnitude of what we are working to achieve. And then the second thing was the third recommendation as a high priority action to include vehicle miles traveled frameworks, which deal a lot with land use investment frameworks and technical assistance. I was out last week, so I did not have a chance to participate in the task group discussions, but I feel like the amount of GHG reduction impact from those areas, when we look at the 2050 modeling results that were included in our carbon reduction strategy for transportation, are minimal, when we very minuscule when we put that compared to our work in advanced clean fleets and the whole electrification framework, including transit electrification. And I think if we're trying to get people to focus on what's important for the next 4 to 5 years and thinking about the monies that we may or may not have available to us, I think when we start diluting the priorities with things that we all know would be helpful and important to have, and that we need to continue to work on, then I think it makes it difficult for legislators and others to determine, oh, should we be, putting money into electric vehicle charging stations, or should we be putting it into sewer and water for, villages and downtowns? And then we start to achieve, not to make the achievements that we could make if we were strategically going sort of down the list of things that are going to give us the biggest bang for the buck as we move forward. So those are the two things I wanted to highlight.
Okay, sure. And I'm noting those as something. Let's circle back to both of them in just one quick second. Does anybody have other things? I'm just noting the 120,000 weatherized homes number, and then the two things that Michelle just said. Secretary Moore?
Number 6, I could use some additional clarity. I mean, it says utility programs, which I'm not sure if they're specific ones or if that's just general. Seek federal or state funding, but it doesn't say for what. I feel like that particular recommendation needs to be built out a little bit more in order to be clear to myself, and I would expect therefore the public. And then the other thing I would flag is number 10, which is around, let's see, is the talks about space and water heating, but it's almost identical to language in the first bullet, sub-bullet under number 8. And I wonder if there's a way to just merge those together or at least not have them be redundant.
Got it. Right. Okay. Joey?
I can hold, if we're gonna come back to it, just was gonna offer some thoughts to what Michelle raised. So I can hold off if this is not the time.
I'm happy to tick through those quickly. I just want to, yeah. So why don't we dive into the, I have them all noted, but why don't we dive into the Michelle stuff real quick? Both the language issue on number 2, and then whether number 3 really is a priority action.
Well,
Joey, you want to jump in on that?
Sure. On the language on number 2, welcome more specificity on what you would offer there, Michelle, for sure. I think the goal is was to sort of supporting your second point is like to really sort of point in the direction of we have a solid foundation of work that's been done. We need to continue to focus on programs that support vehicle electrification and EV charging, and like advanced link cars is one of those things. So if you have more specificity, I think I would welcome that. And then to your other point about sort of VMT not being a significant greenhouse gas emissions, I think we understand that. I don't think that's clear to the public. I think it is a priority for other really valuable reasons, including equity and public health and long-term reduction of emissions. David and I, we've talked about this a little bit, that is not clear when we're having conversations with Vermonters, that the results of the carbon reduction strategy that really honed in on that is not something that is sort of out there, and getting people to understand that so that, yes, we're all making the most informed decisions. And if we want to be investing in transit and other things that we know have many values, and that's why we're lifting it up. We think it's a priority. It's a long-term reduction, pollution reduction strategy, but people should understand that context. But we chose to put it forward because of the long-term benefits and the equity and other co-benefits that we think are supported by that strategy.
Yeah.
Happy to have that conversation, but I think it's fundamentally unclear in the public dialogue and awareness of its role in pollution reductions at this time.
Yeah. And I think if folks notice, there's a line that tries to get at that sort of essence of that concern, right? Where there is a line here that says technical modeling shows that the emissions reductions benefits are less clear. And that's kind of like a nod to saying, this is something that's very important to Vermonters. Vermonters have spoken up repeatedly in public comment and in a variety of places that this is really important. There's a lot of important co-benefits. Emissions reductions benefits are less clear. Yeah. Okay. And can I just circle back on this thing? Because I'd love to be able to sort of quote unquote put things to bed a little bit. Like, is there something, Michelle, that needs to go in here right now before it goes out to public comment that you would want some specificity? Or is it, it sounds like Joey's open and others probably will be open to, like, if you need something real specific in there, let's do that.
Yeah, we have the data, and we can get the data that I think can make this a more targeted action. And I think we also have information from both our 2023 carbon reduction strategy and our 2024 Vermont Smart Growth VMT and GHG research report, which will put into perspective what the actual impacts are for GHG reduction from the VMT strategies and the other sort of associated smart growth strategies. And I think if we could put that data in to help make it clear, so that if a legislator or somebody picks this up and says, oh, we should put the money here, then we can at least say, actually, here's the priority that is really going to move the arrow, move the needle forward right now. So,
in the interest, Michelle, in the interest of doing this in real time, I wonder, and we've done this elsewhere in these documents, in these priority actions, is we've started the priority action, for instance, or a sub-bullet saying, use the following reports or documents to guide investment decisions on X, right? And then you can list these 3 sub-bullets. So I wonder, while we're talking here, if you would mind just typing up what
Yep.
would be essentially the first bullet here that says, use the following documents to, or following studies, technical reports to guide investments in the following areas. And then we can have these 3 bullets.
Beautiful.
Sub-bullets.
Thank you.
And, put your mind in the mind of like other people in this council to make sure that they would be aligned with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. Can we move on to a couple other things? And I think this one, it would be hard to imagine going out to the public without something like this. And I understand, Michelle and others, what you're saying. The amount of interest is so high on this. On other issues, quickly, I'm not sure, Liz isn't here right now. In terms of the Seek state and federal source funding, this was what you flagged. I think, Julie, you had flagged this. I don't know what to say. Does anybody know what to say on this? Rich?
Yeah, I think this is meant to describe the energy efficiency programs, support continued P oversight of utility energy efficiency programs. Seek additional state or federal sourced funding
for those programs.
Yeah.
Okay.
For efficiency? Really?
Is that what this is?
You sure, Rich?
Well, what do you think?
That's not when I read that, and I'm grateful to Jules for flagging it. I don't think efficiency.
What is it?
I don't know, David.
Okay.
So the reason why I'm saying that, Carrick, is if you scroll through these.
Yeah, which I just did. Yeah.
Number 4 focuses on load management programs. And siting.
Generation and siting, yeah.
Number 5 focuses on renewables.
And siting, again.
Yeah. And I wasn't participating in when this language was drafted, but the other major topic area would be in continued investments in end use energy efficiency. And
right.
And
the other major, I'm sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, we're thinking out loud here, Carrick. So it's also the case, and I know they had conversations about the ability of customers to participate in vehicle charging and battery programs. So, but that could have been covered in the demand response and rate design one in the very first one. That there are some service territories where customers, aren't given the same opportunities to participate in an EV charging program.
That makes sense to me. That one makes sense to me.
Okay, so like the charging, can we put a pause in this? And I don't know if it's coming back or not in today's meeting. Is there something we want to say about this right now, or do we want to circle back in just a moment at the end of our meeting today?
Yeah, I think we should come back to it.
Okay, let's come back to this one. The next thing was around the number on the weatherization number. This was an X before. This is additional homes. Rich, can you say a word about this? And I know Julie has a lot of concerns because the numbers don't add up to get there by 2030 at the current pace, not even close. And so I think if we can understand what we're doing here, maybe, and this is where Jane might say a word about the modeling too. Rich?
Yeah, 120,000 homes was the number contained in the last climate action plan. The date, as far as I'm concerned, we can, what's the right word here? We can accept that the date is a problem and leave that open. But the, I think all we're doing here is repeating what we said 4 years ago.
Correct. Yeah. Except now it's not, not feasible.
4 years on. Yeah. And so either the number could change or the date could change. But the goal of weatherizing a really substantial fraction of the housing stock, the 120,000 to me is more important than the date.
Got it. Okay. Jared?
Just for context, when we were deliberating about these recommendations in the thermal task group and then in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, we recognized that we would want to have this number informed by revised and updated pathways analysis. And, for some reasons, contractual, other reasons, just horribly tragic, we do not yet have that updated analysis. And so to me, this feels like, for what goes out for comment, either we use a placeholder that is the existing target, which is what's there now, or we have a blank number, which is kind of where it was when it came up from the task group, and recognize that we need to fill it in once we have the benefit of additional pathways, updated pathways analysis to review and apply as appropriate after review.
Okay, great. Julie?
I just want to offer a little context here. And, I'm happy for the idea of removing the 2030 date or coming up with a different number of homes that may be informed by the modeling. But currently, this year, we are slated to weatherize about 4,000 homes, which is also what happened last year. That's up from about 1,000 when we drafted the initial climate action plan. So a quadrupling of that effort. It takes around $11,000 a home. So right now we're spending about $45 million a year, last year and this year, on those 4,000 homes. And are also sort of running out significant federal funding we've been using to augment our weatherization. And so just worry, absent that any context here, it gets really hard for people to understand the sheer magnitude of what this looks like. And then also just a plug to have some connection here back to workforce, that the potential study that was done by the Department of Public Service noted that there were real challenges around weatherization workforce, and they were projecting a pace of about 6,000 homes a year. And we're saying that. And so we've got something at least on the page right now that would take 15 to 20,000 additional homes a year. And so it doesn't match the workforce as we understand it. It's an incredible amount of resources that would be required to do it. And somehow I just think it's imperative that we contextualize this a little bit more.
Okay, so for this one, I wonder if we actually put, brackets and X's around the date and the numbers, and someone can write up a little line that gets at everything that folks have just said, right? Which is, there's an ambition to do this. Currently, we're at this pace. It costs this amount of money, and we don't have the modeling yet to really know, what's needed and what's feasible. Something along those lines. Would that be okay if we did X's on both the date and the thing and wrote up a little line for public comment? Any concerns about doing that? Do you see what I'm saying? We X out, we put X here and X's
that's
here,
fine.
we write a line.
Yeah. In fact, you can put X, I would put brackets on both of them or put X's in both of them. But somehow we need to convey that, as Secretary Moore just said, this is a substantial challenge, but it is also a high priority to take you know, to move ahead much more quickly than we have in the past. I mean, we've been weatherizing 1,000 homes a year for decades and pretty much getting nowhere. And it's just not enough.
Right. So that line needs to say, this is an important tool. Here's what we're able to do right now. This is what it costs to do it. We're looking for solutions to figure this out, right? Okay. Rich, can I implore you, and maybe you and Julie and I write that line that goes in there? And climate counselors, are you okay with Rich and Julie and I writing that line that would accompany the X's in this document, in this particular action? Any concerns about Julie, Rich, and I writing that?
I'd be grateful if you did, and if you sharpened our priority, just as Rich said very eloquently, as if you made it the supreme priority. I'm not sure that would happen, but you get my drift. Yeah, no objections for me.
Yeah. Yeah, high priority. Yeah. Chris?
We probably can't do this, but like on a lot of these, I almost feel like we should say, here are the targets. Here's what would have to happen to meet the targets. And here's the reality of where we're at. Because I'm a little concerned that that's part of the challenge in engaging with the public is, it's kind of like I'm, talking all the time now about housing targets. What do we need to do to achieve 36,000 housing units by 2029, 2030? And I have to spend a lot of time explaining this is aspirational. We can't do it, but this is what we're saying the need is now. But the thing is, in the absence of that kind of information, under like the towns that I work with, I'm just using this as an example, they're freaking out because they're like, wait a minute, are you saying the towns have to build this housing? No, the towns don't have to build the housing. Towns don't build housing. But I think that's part of the challenge that makes this so daunting and sometimes can make the plan feel like it's just detached from reality, is that lack of context. And I know it'd take a hell of a lot of time to put context under each of these about just how achievable they are. But anyway, I'll shut up about it. But that's part of what concerns me about all this is just how just the realistic achievability of these things. And I mean, even with the best of intentions, but like with the changing federal context, international context, I mean, just the constant evolution where we find ourselves now, I just worry about a lot of this being perceived just so utterly detached from reality. And I'm not beating up the council on this or anything. But just as far as presenting this to the public, just having that context. And I think it's probably, we may not have time to do it in this round, but just putting that out there.
Thanks, Chris. And I appreciate that. And maybe Rich, Julie, and I can get at that in that sentence we're talking about, right? And put some numbers in there and try to put some reality checks in there.
Yeah, and I guess what I was saying, it's not just this one, right? And there's a bunch of items like this, and they're all throughout, right? Just about what it would actually take to hit these targets. But
okay, yeah. All right, there's one more thing I wanted to do before we switch gears, and that is, I think there was a comment about, where was it? This one, that this bullet here feels a lot like the sub bullets up above in this one that we were just looking at. And wondering whether we should be pulling these together. Do people feel strongly about this right now, or is it we're in a place where it's fine to have them separate, and then maybe when we look at these again in May, we'll pull it back together? Does someone have a very strong feeling about trying to combine this right now in real time?
David, can you scroll back down to number 10, please?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think even if there's broad similarity, there's differences in the specifics that are important. So my inclination would be to leave as is for now, but look to future opportunities to streamline.
Okay.
I just wonder
Anyone feel strongly the other way?
I'm sorry, David. I was just going to offer. Sometimes it seems like there is a priority. There's an ideal order for this work to get done. And I'm not, in your mind, is that captured in these? separate but related priorities?
I'm not sure we do in our sort of flashcardy approach to priority actions, we are giving a sequential sense. In the numbering, it was entirely utilitarian and being able to just refer to a number, not giving a number 1 versus number 10, nor a sequence of we do number 1 first and then we work our way down. So I would say the short answer, Carrick, is we haven't been transmitting that. Unless, I think we did it as close as possible in the cap and invest conversation just now, saying like, hey, this is what you need to do first.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I'm just going to pause on this to say, unless Julie, you want to really push back on it, can we hold off on doing combining until May on this one?
Yes, I was going to flag a couple other things.
Uh-oh. Okay.
Sorry.
Oh my God. Yep.
Number 7, this comes back to the comment I made about the about number 1, which is just, we say the recommendation is for a clean heat standard with a cost cap provision, but then the complementary policies will be necessary to carry out a proportion of the emissions reductions to meet the GWSA targets. I guess the question is sort of to what end? The idea of a cost cap provision is to ensure that, I would assume, is to ensure that this is done in a way that is generally affordable. And yet, if we're pursuing complementary policies sufficient to meet the cap, then we're not using the clean heat standard to maximum effect and creating additional burdens somewhere else. And just want to flag a concern about that sentence. And then in number 11, I would suggest taking out the dates entirely. There hasn't been any discussion to my knowledge, and maybe others, I'm happy to be corrected if others have been in front of the legislature advocating for funding, but a September 1st start would require us to receive funding to support this work in our 26 budget, and it doesn't exist right now. And so it just, I think, sets up kind of a crummy expectation from others that there's a path forward. I get that it says contingent on funding, but the fact of the matter is there is no path forward to get that funding available. So the dates they don't make sense right now. I think it would be better to say, conduct a study, the study shall consider, but not I would suggest deleting that first bullet with dates.
Okay. I'm having a little deja vu on this particular issue, and I recognize the concern. I'm curious, folks. I know that there was interest in having dates to show the urgency of it. And then the study on contingent on funding was sort of the compromise of getting the date in there and noting that there was, but you can't get there without funding. So I hear you, Secretary Moore. I wonder if there's a way to get the urgency across. And I don't know if others have a view on how to solve this little problem here. We've definitely been through this one before. Thoughts, Rich?
Well, I think that the compromise is already on the slide. I think the important there is urgency to get this work underway, and we'd like the Climate Council to communicate that to the legislature.
Right. So this is really more of a signal to the legislature than anyone else.
Well, I'm appreciating Secretary Moore's concern with the budget. Our job is to make recommendations to, as best as we can, meet the goals of the GWSA. And putting a date in here helps to, strengthen that.
I guess I'd push back on that, Rich. I don't see that it helps strengthen it in that nobody is advocating for that funding. FY26 starts July 1st. And we're not, neither my agency nor the department is going to have the resources to do it. So I'm not sure what the date does other than make us look like we're going to fail before we even get out of the gate.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, and this is another one is, again, just kind of my sense, my feeling that some of this is just kind of, it makes us appear detached from reality, and it worries me. I understand it's urgent. I understand this is ideally what we would do. But it also just comes across as just not being reflecting the kind of, very real spiral that we're in, downward that we're in now, as far as resource availability to do a lot of stuff we really want to do. But the reality of the situation we're facing just to provide just basic services to the state. So, yeah, I don't know where to go with this, but.
Well, one place we could go with it is take Secretary Moore's suggestion and just remove the bullet with the dates in it.
Right. Or change that bullet to say, this is urgent, right? Just say it's urgent.
Well, it is an important element of the work that has to be done. But, to be also realistic about this, Vermont is not going to adopt emission-based equipment standards without doing so in coordination with other states. And so, this isn't something that we're just going to, jump out of the gate and do. So, the goal of this recommendation is for us to do the study that would enable us to join other states if other states are acting. So that's the urgency, is to be ready to act.
Got it. Okay. So pull the date out for Julie's regions of like, there's no signal right now that this funding is going to be available for this round. Why are we going to do something we know is destined to fail? David, and then Jared, and then let's wrap up. We're at time for public comment, so I want to respect that. So let's just do another minute or two here. Dave?
I was just going to suggest, I think this is a recommendation that just exists in a vacuum, or it's directed at the agency. We should not have recommendations that are infeasible and put in imaginary dates. So I agree with the secretary that we should take out the dates, or maybe better is to direct this to the legislature, that the legislature should provide funding to enable the department to conduct a study, and then maybe put in dates that are 6 months or a year later than the current dates.
Thanks. All right. Jared?
So in the task group and in the committee, there was a lot of discussion about this. We recognize that this is a really important, very high priority potential pathway that needs initial steps to get underway. The two compromises that were made were adding the contingent on securing funding and moving that second date back out an additional year. So it says by June 30th of 2027. My suggestion in response to the concerns that have been raised as a way to thread the needle would just be to delete the start by September 1st, 2025, if it is uncertain whether funding will be made available this year, next year, or at all. And the at all is captured by the contingent on securing funding. But if funding is made available either in this year's budget process or in next year's budget process, it would still be possible to file a report with the council by June 30th of 2027. So if the concern is starting in September of this year, my recommendation would be just change that first bullet to say, file a report with the Climate Council by June 30th, 2027, more than 2 years from now, and leave in the study is contingent on securing funding.
Great. Okay. That seems, I appreciate you trying to thread the needle there, Jared. I'm just curious if we did that, any major concerns with that, or does that feel like the right kind of compromise here?
Why would, friendly amendment, Jared, is there a reason not to actually say recommend that the legislature provide sufficient funding to conduct the study.
Right.
I think that would be fine to make explicit. I think it's implied, but I think it's good to make that explicit.
Okay. Julie?
Yeah, I think with that change, because it does right now say the implementation lead is ANR in the department, I think making clear the legislature has a role to play if this work is to proceed is really important.
Great. Got it. Okay. So this is what I'd like to do. I want to take a pause and do some public comment. Then we need to take a break because we've been doing this for a while. We have to go in and look at some other issues over the break. In addition to taking a break, I encourage everyone to put their heads together to think about, you know, when I say together, put your own head in place to think about anything else you want to talk about on the updates that have happened since March 10th. I'll give folks a little bit of time to sit and read. But we're going to have to do a quick overview if there's anything folks want to lift up with any changes that were made. There's two things we absolutely do need to talk about. One is biomass, and the other is a recommendation on the renewable energy siting, where there's like an potential alternative put on the table. So those are two we absolutely need to talk about. Biomass and the renewable energy siting one that's under Ag and Eco. It's the last one in Ag and Eco. But in the meantime, I'd like to do some public comment. So as is usual, the way we're doing public comment these days and I can include folks who are subcommittee members and others who aren't members of the council in this. It's nice to have the input from subcommittee members and others who are joining us. Let's do sort of max 2-minute interventions if folks would like to speak, and I'll help facilitate that. And do exactly what Alice is doing and raise your hand in the Zoom. If you're having a hard time, send me a text. Or if you're really having a hard time, I'll take a moment, just you can open up your mic. I'll figure out how to get you. But Alice, you're up first. Thanks for being here.
Yes. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, you're great.
Thank you. I'm a member of the rural and oh gosh, I can't even remember what committee I'm on now.
Rural resilience adaptation.
Right. I'm on so
Yeah.
many committees.
Yeah.
And I was the chairperson of the Public Health Task Group. And I been reading through the flashcards, and I think the most important thing about public health is completely missed. It's not there. Public health is all about tracking, informing, and then acting on disease prevention and mitigation. Climate change has a huge impact on vector-borne diseases, waterborne diseases, ticks, clean air that affects us. If we're not healthy, we're not going forward. And the big challenge is, how do we remain healthy in this climate change environment? Equity, I also feel, is best addressed in the mission statements of the Department of Public Health, and I encourage you to read those on the public health website under About Us, our mission, values, etc. Health equity itself is just built right into public health, and working on that public health task group, this was our #1 priority, was how do we stay healthy in the current environment? The second thing is, I'd like to back up the issues of funding. Already, the federal government has withdrawn $7 million in federal funding to the Department of Public Health. And that has affected 2 priorities already in these flashcards. And one is the social services and the mental health services. And the second one is the huge one. It ends money for immunization programs in the state. That's huge. Now, where is $7 million going to come from? I think this legislature, as we keep going to them for funding, I think the legislature is going to be making some very hard choices of what's funded and what isn't, or what they can't fund. So I think this funding is going to be an ongoing issue. It shouldn't.
Alice, I'm just gonna
Yeah,
just
it-
jump in and say to wrap up, and I have a follow-up question for you, if you don't mind, which is
Okay.
the very
Oh.
first thing you mentioned, which was we're missing the most important public health piece. That's a little concerning because
Mhm.
these are pulled from the Excel documents that came out of the task group work. So I'm just wondering, can you just say it one more time? Like, what is it? What's the missing action?
The missing action is to recognize the importance and to promote the work that public health does. Tracking, alerting the state on crises like pandemics, like ticks, like vector-borne diseases and waterborne diseases, like air quality. And the
That's
third,
helpful.
and the other one is to come up with how do we help mitigate that?
Okay, so I think maybe folks,
That's really
I
it
don't know
for
who else
me.
is here from the task group, but I want to jump to John in just a moment, but I feel like maybe it's lost from the detail of 12, which is providing increased capacity and strengthening messages and awareness, messaging and awareness around local and state emergency preparedness.
That came out of emergency preparedness issues. And it came out of, I think it needs to all be wrapped up in education, emergency preparedness, with the overarching thing being the importance of getting the messages and tracking of our public health data out there.
Okay, thanks, Alice. I really appreciate that. And let's see what the council does with that.
Thank you.
Appreciate those comments. John, over to you.
Yeah, John Brayman and from Calais, but I also work for Vermonters for a Clean Environment.
John, can you speak up a little bit because your audio is not super loud?
John Brayman, I work for Vermonters for a Clean Environment. Also, I'm a resident of Calais. I'm here in person today, so I would ask that the Climate Council really heed what Julie Moore, Alice Peel, and Chris Campany have been saying. They keep bringing you back to what's going on out there in the world that I inhabit. And the elephant in the room, both here and at the legislature, seems to be what is likely impending in terms of the striking of funding resources that we have historically relied upon from Washington, D.C. As a former state employee and an active union member, I can well remember 2010 when there was a slashing of state employee positions. And what is likely to be happening, what they're threatening to do to us in DC across every state, is much more substantive than we have had experience in 2010. Which was really, 2010 was devastating to the ancient natural resources. That's where I worked and lived. There is likely to be massive layoffs across the board, across state government. And while the legislature right now is rightly plodding along, moving ahead, putting a budget together based on historic revenue flows, everyone knows that they're going to probably be there right up until October 1 when the federal budget year kicks in. And then some, trying to figure out what our budget will be. So to the extent that we can get grounded in reality, folks, not that we should give up all hope, but from the last election, I think folks on this climate council should pay attention. Chris Campany, he's paying attention. Alice Peel is paying attention. Listen to what the voters did last November. Vermont doesn't have the capacity financially. The households don't have the capacity, nor do we have the tax base to put forward all these wonderful programs. I mean, it'd all be great. If I was a billionaire, I'd like to do a lot of things that I can't do now. And I think it's important that you really spend more time, less time talking among yourselves, which seems to be hundreds of hours spent, and more time actually engaging the public, and maybe to the extent the public doesn't show up for meetings, figure out what's wrong and how to better engage them. Get out there in public, not on Zoom, but in person. So
John, I'm just going to interrupt to say,
I'm almost done, and then you can interrupt. I need my flow to keep going here. So I think from what I'm seeing here today is I see constructive discussion, which I'm encouraged by, and maybe with the exception of clarification language that seems to be being suggested in the language from the various task groups or subcommittees, that the recommendations not be substantially amended, but that they be put out to the public more or less as drafted, and let the public weigh in and inform you all, and inform even the subcommittees and task
John,
groups.
I really do need to jump in, and I appreciate that. I really appreciate the comments, and thank you. And thank you for coming in person as well.
Yeah.
I see Cheryl Joy's got a hand up.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Thank you for taking my comment. And so I'm just going to say this initially, and that I agree that this almost feels futile because of the funding situation, you know, that John, Chris, Alice are all talking about, and that we all see what's going on. So it is a little nerve-wracking. But I'm going to actually pretend I'm just going to go on anyway, even though I think that that it does feel futile because of that. First of all, I have a suggestion process-wise is if you have you've got an agenda, I wish to stick with the agenda and timing, even though you don't finish the topic, so that people can plan to be around at the meeting when the agenda topic is supposed to be addressed. For example, it's really too bad that Ryan Patch isn't here because, he had to leave, and the topic of the Ag and Eco recommendations were supposed to be an hour ago. And so it's too bad that he's not here to talk about that. And I'm glad Jael's here. But I also want to reiterate, I was going to say what John was leading into at the end, which is that I really think it's important to leave the recommendations as they are and put that out to the public and see what the public has to say about it. And then make your changes because, rather than just changing it before the public even has a chance to weigh in on it, unless they come to meetings like this, which I periodically do. A couple of things that are really important to make sure are in there, and I don't know what you're going to talk about today, but one is citing renewable resources on land that is agricultural or forested is it's negative on climate and carbon sequestration and storage and wise land use. I know it's not nice for some of the, businesses that are financially invested in doing things on that land, but it's the right thing to do with regard to climate.
Sure. I'm just going to give you a note. We're wrapping up here.
One more thing I'm going to say thank you. I'll wrap up, but I'm really not taking a lot of time. Make sure you put in everywhere you can that we need to count all the greenhouse gases, not only the non-biogenic greenhouse gases. They all do the same thing in the atmosphere. You've got to count all of it. And there's a lot more to talk about.
I'm sure. Yeah, no, thanks, Cheryl, for those comments. I appreciate them. And they were clear. We've got another hand with Annette Smith. Annette, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, I have a couple of comments. I put in the chat a link to a Climate Council agenda item from February 16th, 2023, where the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee got excellent presentations on weatherization. They contain data and numbers, and I think it's important to base whatever recommendations you're making on reality. For some reason, and I'm not sure I understood why, there's some sort of funding cliff that happens in 2027. And so, this council's done a lot of work. You need to go back and look at it. On the appliance standards, I'll acknowledge that recommendation was changed from actually recommending adopting a standard to turning it into a study. I think that if other states are doing it, then why not learn from them instead of suggesting Vermont do its own study? And to that end, the primary product I've seen from this Climate Council is studies by consultants. And I'd like to see a list of all the consultants that have resulted from the Global Warming Solutions Act through all the state agencies and all the recommendations that have come out of it. How many different entities have been hired and what has it cost before you go recommending more studies? However, my final comment is that the study on biomass that I think needs to be done is why the Climate Council has had so much trouble, both the last time and this time, coming up with recommendations on biomass. Because clearly it's a problem. Clearly there is a problem with the process that is bringing it to the last minute once again to try and figure out what to put in. And so if you're going to do a study, that's what I'd suggest you study. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Annette. Appreciate those comments. Just checking if other members of the public or folks who have joined us today have a comment. Okay. I appreciate folks showing up and being part of the conversation. I know it's probably super annoying to have me come in at 2 minutes and be like, we're done. But I appreciate folks showing up. I do want to make sure everybody's aware that there are a significant amount of engagement opportunities and in-person public engagement that's happening in April. If folks are not aware, maybe Sophie or Jane or someone could throw the flyer in the chat. There are in-person events happening across the state in April, as well as virtual opportunities and other things that are happening. Okay, great. I think what needs to happen, a couple of things. One is I'm trying to tidy up my notes so we can look at what we agreed to for the next steps on the cross-sector stuff we just worked on. So I'm going to be doing that over a break. And we do need to take a break now, even though it's a little late. I think we all just need to gather our thoughts here. Let's come back in 10 minutes. And we're going to look at that punch list. And I really want to encourage folks to think about anything that needs addressing before it goes out to public comment with the appropriate caveats as a draft. Anything in the updates from March 10th, because a fair number of these were updated based on that action list that we created out of that meeting. So let's be back in 10 minutes. That's like, what is it? It's 1:13. So we'll be back at, let's just call it 1:25. We'll be back at 1:25. And I'd encourage everyone to sort of think about your own personal punch list of anything else you want to talk about and see how close we get. I'll get my notes tidied up and we can review what we just did with CSM. Okay, we'll see you back here at 1:25. Okay, so we're back after a break. Thanks, folks. So for a time check, we have until about 1:40 or make it 1:45 to do some additional substantive work. We want Jane to give us an update on the modeling progress, and then we need to talk about it in April meeting. But really what we need to do is see if we're there with the content we need to get out the door for these April meetings. There's two things we absolutely need to talk about in addition to what we just spoke about, and they're in the cards. I mentioned them before the break. I want to dive there in just a second. Before we do, I'm going to show you the kinds of notes I'm taking of what we already did to show you that I think if we agree on these notes, then we may be in a good place in terms of what we already talked about today in the CSM stuff. So let me just show you the way I'm taking notes. And let me know if this is too small. I'll make it bigger. All right, so these are just my notes of the actions that need to happen based on what you all said you wanted to have happen earlier in the meeting, right? So as we look at this, spell out the acronyms, that's easy. For Cap and Invest, we looked at some new combined sort of mashed up language that had the original recommendation initial language plus some new next steps language. I think, Jane, you posted that that little blurb online, and so it should be there. Folks can look at that. And we talked about lifting this up above transportation and buildings so that it sort of sits at a slightly higher plane than the particular sectoral stuff. So that's what we have on this, and there seemed to be some emerging willingness to at least take that out to the public and let the public have a conversation about it. Okay, on transportation, we said the second recommendation or concerns are fairly vague, and Michelle's been diligently trying to make it less vague. And so this is what I pasted out of the chat from Michelle, where it's specific references to the Clean Transportation Incentive Program report, specific references to the Pathways 2.0 report on charging and things like that, and the EV, this report. So we named the reports that can guide the investments. So if this is the specificity that may have been lacking and now can get a little bit clearer if folks are comfortable taking a look, it's what was in the chat from Michelle. All right. Also, transportation, the third one about public transportation, transit, and the like, at least for now, keep it in there. We recognize there's a line in there that talks about how its emissions benefits are not as clear. We don't know, I'm not quite sure what to do about the electricity thing, and Liz isn't here, I don't think. So this is the one that befuddles me. We'll get to that in a second. We talked about merging buildings number 10 with another one. We said, no, let's leave it separate for now. We talked about the weatherization numbers, and we said, take the number and the date out, and we write a line explaining what the target, the ambition, and the reality is. And, this is what the targets are. This is what it means to reach those targets. We said Rich and Julie could agree on some text about that one sentence that would accompany why there's X's in the document. And then on the building equipment standard, we talk about explicitly asking the legislature to fund the study, and we talked about deleting the start date for the study, although not the end date. Okay, so those are my notes, and it's like a punch list of things. And if that feels like an accurate punch list from our earlier conversation, then we can say, great, I can run with that and work with you all and implement that exactly the way you said to do that. And make sure we make those changes before it goes out. So that's one thing. And I just welcome if anybody wants to push back and say, oh, no, those aren't the right notes. You didn't get that right.
David, it's
Yeah.
Michelle. I just, there were a couple of other reports that I referenced, and I'll resend those to you relative to this language. I think you mostly got all of the things, but.
Okay, sorry. Yeah,
That's
if you
all
can
right.
just get the right references and all, we can do that. And folks, you can see it in the chat here. And thanks, Michelle. Okay. Okay, so if this is an okay way to move forward, and I'm leaving that as an if. Rich, were you trying to get in there? Sorry. You're good.
You're on a roll. I didn't want to interrupt you, but
Okay. Well, I wanted to pivot to the other pieces, Agonico and the like.
okay, let me just offer that I think with electricity number 6, it lacks specificity, and I can work with Liz to explain what that was about. I think that derived from a conversation about making, helping Vermonters to get their homes electrification ready, which included some programs that are offered in some service territories, but not in others, including transformers and panel upgrades and EV charging capabilities in homes. So I think that was electrification ready recommendation.
Right. Okay.
Not to I think this is friendly, Rich, but Dave, I just had a text exchange with Liz to say, what the heck were you doing on this? And Rich, I think I faithfully conveyed, I could read the text, but I think that'd be tedious, but essentially said, Rich thought it was focused on efficiency. What Liz says was it was on affordability, with efficiency being one of the measures.
All right. Well, how about that you and Liz and I figure out how to state that?
Okay. Happy to do that. Thank you.
Love it. Always dangerous. You get yourself a job there, Carrick. All right.
You're telling me that, David? No shit.
Okay. All right. So we good to move on to the other stuff? Great. So we know there's two things that require attention. Let me start sharing screen here. And one is the biomass. And so I'm happy to start there. And then the other is the siting one that's related to renewable energy siting, where we had some back and forth in our last council meeting on March 10th. We talked about some potential changes to that. And then there's like an alternative text thing there. And let's see what we want to do. Like maybe we go out with both. I don't know. You guys can figure that out. But let's start with biomass. Okay. Now, included in your meeting materials was the addendum that you all as a council wrote a little over a year ago and approved. And so I want to remind people where the subcommittee left this. Where the subcommittee left it is in their final meeting, they were trying to figure out where there was the greatest alignment, and where most members, not all, most members felt represented is by this first piece, right? Which is to fund and undertake as soon as possible the study that you all requested in your addendum. And they put this line, in the meantime, enact a moratorium on approvals of new biomass utility scale electric energy facilities. Okay, so that's where the subcommittee most. However, it was definitely not unanimous. And some folks wanted to be more, what I would qualify as sort of more aggressive, and were felt more represented by this statement. State agencies should eliminate biomass as a utility scale energy source and stop referring to it as renewable energy. And other subcommittee members felt like actually this last one here is essentially saying do what's in the addendum, because the addendum at the end, in addition to funding, asking for the study, says in the meantime, PUC, you should be paying attention to the issues we're raising as addendum if you get things that come across your plate prior to this study being done. So this is essentially stick to the addendum. So some folks felt most represented by that. You all as a council need to make a decision about this. I have heard different opinions. A lot of folks have expressed some interest in this one I'm highlighting right now, which is the sort of stick to the addendum. That's where you got to. I know that at least one of you in the council feels more represented by some of this other stuff. So I'm just curious, are there things that people want to say prior to us just doing a pulse check in the chat? If I were to do this as like 1, 2, 3, and I can do that more elegantly. Before we do that pulse check, and how folks, anything folks want to say on this, having gone back and looked at your addendum. And by the way, the addendum references the studies and the presentation that happened at that sort of subgroup task group level last time. Anything folks want to say about biomass before we do a quick pulse check on this? Jared?
Thanks, David. I would love to be able to support the first bullet point language there. It's where I wish we could be, but personally, I would be most comfortable with the third and final one. And the reason for that is because of new developments that have occurred since this language was drafted. And that is, I mean, so for context, and I would invite Commissioner Johnson or others to comment on this, but over half of Vermont's electricity portfolio is from Hydro-Quebec, about a quarter if we're talking about energy deliveries. And with the threat and sometimes on again, off again reality of tariffs, some of our baseload energy supply that has long been assumed, I don't think we can safely and confidently assume it, unfortunately, in these times. And so to me, the idea of taking off of the table options for how we maintain reliability and resilience in our electric grid, given the geopolitical circumstances of our time, does not feel wise. And as much as I hope for and will work for fully renewable future, both when it comes to electricity generation and our overall energy use, given the uncertainty, especially around one of our primary resources of our electricity supply right now, I don't think it is a wise time to be taking options off the table, especially if one of the potential consequences of doing so could be to lead to increased dependence on fossil fuel generation.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Jared. Anything else folks want to say before we do a quick pulse check in the chat about biomass and these three options?
Just want to
Jael?
say I agree with Jared.
Oh, thanks, Carrick. Yep. Jael?
So my understanding is that Vermont has, and I could be completely wrong about this, but that we have an agreement with Hydro-Quebec that our energy use is not impacted by tariffs. And I don't know, maybe Carrick could clarify that. But so even if the Midwest states don't have that agreement, I guess, with their energy that they get from Canada. And then I'd also like to raise the point that, the Trump administration is looking at logging a lot of forest around this country. And so Vermont, and other states won't look at protecting their forest as well as we will. So I think we just need to consider that we have the potential to keep our forests intact and sequester a lot of carbon.
Thanks, Jael. Okay. Yeah, Carrick, there was a specific question to you on that in terms of the tariffs things. I don't know if there's an answer to that.
Jael raised a good, thank you, raised a good point. So it's most lawyers agree, and that's Hydro-Quebec, ISO New England, independent system operator for New England, the New York independent system operator, lawyers for the Vermont distribution utilities, our lawyers agree that so far, first of all, energy tariffs have not traditionally been subjected to tariffs. Secondly, this particular agreement, the nature of it, it's an internal bilateral transaction between a US-based subsidiary of Hydro-Quebec and the Vermont utilities, another layer of protection. And then thirdly, it's the provisions of the contract, but if you're in that space, which there may be, then it's just even messier and it's not assured. So there are lines, to Jael's point, there are lines of protection. They're not completely impervious to challenge, but for right now, it looks better than it would. But the fundamental problem is you've damaged the relationship. There was already initial discussions about a follow-on contract. This is hurt. There's big transmission projects that were in play, continue to be in play with Hydro-Quebec by the equally as important on Vermont's energy future. And Jared kind of alluded to this. The crushing by the Trump administration of offshore wind, plus you destroy the relationship with Hydro-Quebec, means where do we get our energy at scale the way we're going to need to? So that is now fomenting very active conversations on small modular reactors for nuclear, as well as is there the potential for a natural gas pipeline, which I haven't heard discussed in New England for a decade. And so there are those kind of conversations. So that gives you a flavor of where are we going to get our energy at scale.
Thanks. So I want to do just a few more comments, and then I want to do a pulse check in the chat about where folks are standing, just in the interest of time. Kelly, and then Joey, and then let's do a quick check.
Yeah, I just wanted to also offer, and so my understanding is that the existing biomass plants we have are not, they're pretty old. They maybe weren't built with the latest technology for being, not producing a lot of emissions. There's not a lot of heat recapture. If, people were like, oh gosh, cars are super polluting and super dangerous. We can't build any new cars, but you can keep driving your really old, dangerous ones until they break down. I think there's potential that shutting down all new technology advances that's where I think the study can help with understanding where this might be a potential. But I also think the study needs to be looking at these existing buildings and these existing facilities and being like, yeah, they're not doing great. So I am optimistic about advancing technology, and that's why I don't want to just be like, and never again can we build another car because the Model T Ford is really bad. So that's sort of where I also lean towards the third bullet point there, which is what we recommended in the biomass addendum.
Thanks, Kelly. Joey?
Just a couple of thoughts. So in the third, fund and undertake this study as soon as possible, does that include, in the meantime, enact a moratorium on approvals? No. Okay. And I wonder, because of the implications of the changing dynamic, not to broaden it too much, but it does seem, yeah, okay. Never mind. I think we all need to better understand the implications of what's happening at the federal level across the board, I think. And as it relates to this, that may be important. I'm open to the third one as well. I wonder about the enacting moratorium, but I don't know. And more importantly, to Secretary Moore's point, if we're going to recommend it, we need to actually work to get it funded. Like, this seems like a really important piece of work that we have not undertaken, and we need to, like, I know that money is scarce at this moment, and that's a challenging dynamic, but I don't know who would advocate. I don't know if that's us, but it feels like we need to do this analysis, and it needs to be done soon, and we need to make the case for this being a really important priority.
Thanks, Joey. Okay, and there is a typo in that last one, so I apologize.
Yeah, it's also hard to read
in the chat right now. It's a messy typo. It's just fund and undertake as soon as possible the study recommended by the council. That's what it should say. And so I'll drop it in the chat right now. So I'm putting in the chat sort of this as a 1, 2, 3 option thing. And what I'd like all climate counselors to do is in the chat, say the version they feel most represented by, that they think is the appropriate one. Let's just do a pulse check. So let me drop it in here, and I've tried to fix that typo in the final one. And if anybody has any questions about that the third one as well, the guidance to the PUC, it's what's in the addendum as of now. It's basically just saying everything that's in the addendum, the study and that guidance to the PUC is what's being recommended. That's number 3. So counselors, I just dropped in the chat for everybody. If you could just say, which of these 3 do you feel most represented by? Yeah, and I think, David, thank you for making that that disclosure there. So I think it's helpful for everyone to know. So thanks, David, for that. I'm just watching the chat like all of you. Okay, other counselors who haven't dropped something in the chat. Okay, so with one exception, the number 3 is clearly rising up to the surface is something, basically what you feel most represented by right now. So my recommendation of given that is that when you go out for public comment, you go out with the third one. And, you know, and see how the reactions you get to that. Okay. Any concerns with, yeah, and link to the addendum. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So just double checking. Everyone's okay. We go out to public comment with the number 3, link to the addendum, and get some comment based on that. Great. Okay. Okay. Next, what I want to check with you all before we finish up here is that on this one, just give me 1 second to find it. It's the citing one. Here we go. So on the citing one, we talked about this a little bit last time. Liz had some concerns about it. And some counselors went and, you know, tried to do alternative text that address some of those concerns. And so this is one way to do it. And what this alternative text does is it takes out this the disincentives language of right here. Sorry, it's hard for me to highlight stuff. This alternative text takes out the disincentives language. And it also takes out this word on rules. However, I'm just curious in the short time we have, if folks would like to try to settle on one of these two, or you could go out with both of them. I'm curious, counselors, if you have a thought on what you'd like to do with this one. And I know Liz isn't even here, but this is the language that came out of the subcommittee, which it talks about utilize financial incentives and citing policy rules and regulations to motivate things. And then it also uses disincentives to avoid and minimize forest clearing and use of agricultural land. This one does some of that, but not all of that. Counselors, strong feeling about whether to go out with both or to try to select one now. Kelly? And then Carrick?
Hesitate to remove forest clearing. Like, I don't know if it needs to be a disincentive, but if people are clearing forest to put up solar arrays because there's no disincentive, that's a problem. If people are putting wind power in the forest, I think that's less of a problem, although it comes with some potentially, like, maintaining forest corridors and things can be a problem there. I think there was an argument that someone put forward that sometimes it is a way to keep our farms as farms if another income source could be putting a solar array on a field that's otherwise not producing enough for the farm, and not, you know, they could put a solar field out and graze their sheep under it, and it's a net positive for everybody. So, but yes, any clearing of forest, I feel like should just be disincentivized. So that was the one part that otherwise I like the alternative text.
Thanks, Kelly. Carrick?
Not to complicate, I would say this. I prefer the lower one, but I want the, I would, for my point of view, my particular point of view, I would still want to keep disincentives on the table, though. So you could have a balance of tools. Some of the other stuff I'm comfortable losing. I don't know, rules, regulations. I think that's tiny bubbles, but fine. But in terms of the panoply of options, I would want to have the ability to have disincentives as well as incentives. But I like the land use language better in the second one, quite honestly.
Okay. Chris, and then David?
Yeah, I think I'm one of the ones who brought up the solar on ag land as a means to both generate energy and also generate income for farmers. I kind of like what Kelly was saying as far as disincentivizing forest clearing. I still like to, and again, this is probably my fault for just not knowing exactly what feedback we've heard from farmers, but I don't feel as strongly about disincentivizing on agricultural land. Certainly would have issues with encouraging it on, agricultural land that would also be that should potentially be restored back to habitat and other, greenhouse gas mitigating functions. But anyway, so in my perfect world, the alternative text would say and disincentivizes forest clearing.
Okay. Thanks. David?
Yeah, I'm the one who kind of drafted this language, and I don't really feel strongly about it. I was trying to figure out, I was really sharing more in the spirit of brainstorming, and I didn't anticipate it would come to the full committee for this kind of parsing. But I was trying to anticipate what I understood Liz's concern to be. She had a concern first about the use of regulations, the term regulations. And I took out rules just because I think it's redundant, but I don't care about that. But the taking out the regulations that would disincentivize, because I understood her concern to be, she didn't think it was fair to have a special unique land use restriction on renewable energy that didn't apply to all development. And that makes a certain amount of sense to me. It wouldn't make sense, for instance, that we didn't allow a solar array to go in someplace, but we did allow a Walmart to be constructed there. So that my goal was just to kind of have this be more strategically parsed and focused on the need to have regulatory programs that, as I think they currently do, actually through the PUC, create certain incentives and prioritization of siting of renewable resources on places that are already developed. So that I offer all that just by way of explanation.
Thanks, David. Jael? I'm just conscious of time here.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, it definitely can add an income stream for farmers. The only issue is that, like, if they're raising sheep and then they sell their farm and the next farmer wants to raise cows, then that will create an issue. Because you can't have cows with solar panels.
Okay. Peter?
Hi, first, thanks to everyone who did this great work. Just in talking to the folks that work with REV, they very much would appreciate additional financial incentives to help them put renewables up in the already disturbed environment. I know many people in my organization would really like to see that. And I just want to reiterate what David said. From a land use perspective, I don't see what the difference is between a Dollar General and a 500 kW solar array. I mean, if we're concerned about helping folks keep the land open and keeping it forested, I don't know why renewables should be treated any differently. And let's say someone clearing a forest to put up a 2-mile driveway in a 4,000 square foot private residence. So I hope we would consider that before you move forward with any kind of disincentives to not treat renewable energy different. Thank you.
Okay. So if I were to summarize what I just heard, it seems like there's interest. There's interest in using that second one, but something about forest clearing and something about having disincentives on the table, while at the same time not holding renewables to some higher standard than other types of development or activity that would occur. I'm not sure how to do that, honestly. And I'm not sure we can do that in real time. I don't know. We've got, just a minute or two left in our meeting today. I mean, if folks want to play around with language like what I'm sharing on the screen, I think you can see what I'm sharing on the screen, right? So this is what, this was that updated language, this version 2. And then you could have some line here that talks about forest clearing and disincentives, and you could say, you could say something about not holding to a standard that's different than others. Peter, is that an old hand or a new hand, Peter?
I'd like to raise my hand. I just want to say, for me, well, I think there's a big difference between clearing land in a contiguous forest block, which could threaten some ecological integrity, and clearing, some trees on the side of the road or some brand new poplars up in a old gravel pit. Like, so we really should be looking at what kind of trees we're talking about. There's a big difference in terms of impact on, you know, our ecology.
Right. So like we're talking here about contiguous forest and, you know, ecologically important, blah, 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 right? Okay. Folks, do you want to take a swing at this right now? What do we do? Honestly, I'm a little worried we're at a very late game here. Are folks comfortable? Could someone shout out or put in the chat from a counselor standpoint of what this final sentence might look like? Again, we're just going out for public comment. We're not signing off for everything. Kelly, do you want to shout it out and give it a try?
Honestly, I think maybe, and I put this in the chat a little bit, that disincentives should maybe be its own thing, or possibly in this be a second. Someone said something about this, a second bullet point where it's like use the incentives and then something about use disincentives to avoid forest clearing for renewables as well as other development or something. I don't know what the word development, but maybe it's its own thing or like its own action, or at least like a separate, because it sounds like from what I'm hearing from a few people that there are different that renewables are like, oh, you can clear forest for that, but you can't put a Walmart there in some municipalities. So I think it shouldn't be lost.
Right. So holding renewables to similar standards as other development, right? Okay. Folks, what do we say? Do you want to assign someone to fix this? And you have confidence that they can go out and fix this, and make sure it's not messy and a mistake? Do people want to hold up their hands and be like, hey,
I nominate Liz since she's not here.
okay, I would want to pair Liz, which is, I love how I would want to pair Liz with, you know, say Kelly or someone else who's been voicing some opinion on this, or JL, who is was a co-chair, Joey.
I think you've pretty much got it with what you got, but that's just my opinion. I don't know how much, but anyway.
Okay. Joey and Jael, quickly.
Yeah, no, I think it's close. I did just want to, in your particularly XX, sort of clarify, which I appreciated Peter's point of like contiguous, you know, forests and like ecologically sensitive. I think that would be important to get in there. Maybe the words, could you include those words here? And then I don't know if yet Liz seems important to include in this. And I don't know, David, if you worked on this already with her, maybe you'd be willing to wordsmith, but I think directionally this makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
I would just add that I think Annette raised a good point that Ryan Patch should be part of that discussion as well.
Great. So what if we say
people not here?
Yeah, clean this up, right? David P, David M, Liz, Ryan, and anyone else, right? We'll make a small group. We'll get it out this week. As long as you all are comfortable assigning the sort of final wordsmithing of this to a little group. Is that all right?
I think I'm not the right person. I think you are on the right track. Find someone who's got a strong opinion about this. I was just trying to be a peacemaker. I don't have
right. Great.
David, there's also Billy's comment about pathway 4.
Okay.
You know, I don't know if you saw his email last week, but kind of covers this language about the development piece. And so we could just combine them or reference them. I also think that for transparency reasons, like having both samples to the public so they can kind of look at our thought process and decide, oh yeah, actually we like this wording better. Give the public more options.
Okay. So what if we make this little group, and then the group can actually make both versions available saying we're working on this kind of thing? Yeah. Okay, great. Anything else we want to say on this? Are folks comfortable with this as a pathway? In terms of this group of folks cleaning this up, making sure it's okay, And then if it really is substantially different, then having both available. Okay, we're at the top of the meeting. We're very, very close, but we're not 100% there. I want to just check real quick. In addition to the two things we just worked on, are there other things in the revisions that you had put on, individuals put on their punch lists that they would want to see completed before this goes out? Anything else? Joey?
Sorry, I just want to go back to the question of if we're recommending a study on biomass, what's the process to, I mean, I'd love to see this move forward, and I want to better understand the process so that it's not a hollow recommendation.
So I think it's a full-throated recommendation to the legislature and to the administration, do this thing, fund it and do it. That's what it is.
We'd had that on the table before, though, I guess is my point. So I know these are tight times. This feels like one of those things that we've been circling around and deserves an answer and analysis. So Secretary Moore, I welcome your input.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was in one of the first years of the Climate Council, the council sent a letter to the legislature advocating for the legislatively appointed member sent a letter to the legislature advocating for funding for certain priorities. That hasn't happened, and so would encourage legislatively appointed members to consider that. I mean, we recommend to the governor, and he considers in light of his priorities what goes into his budget, but certainly I think the council has an opportunity to make a set of recommendations too, and just hasn't done that in the last couple of years.
Okay, so maybe a next step on that is finding time for the council, and we can work with the steering committee on how to do that. Finding time for the council. If the council wants to be, in addition to the climate action plan, wants to talk about specific funding priorities. And again, it's awkward because the administration kind of takes a step back when it actually is time to sign that document. But the council can schedule time to make that conversation happen. Okay. So I do want to check one more time though, because even though we're a little over time, I want to see if we've gotten to a place with the appropriate caveats and the changes you all want to see. We've gotten to a place where we can take these action steps and get these things out the door for public meetings, which start next week. Our first virtual public meeting is the end of next week. If you all are ready for that. As you as a council are comfortable with the changes we talked about today, and updating the documents and putting them out there as draft priority recommendations with the caveats written all over them. Do councilors have any concern about that? JL?
I don't have concern with what we discussed today. I do have concern about one of the number one of the ag and eco recommendations. The language was just changed a lot, and I think it kind of missed the meaning of what that subcommittee was trying to capture. I know we're at time, but maybe we can just check in about that, why that language was taken out. I know there was a recommendation, but I would like to show that that language was there in the original recommendation that came out of the Ag and Eco subcommittee.
Sorry, the number one?
Of the Ag and Eco priority recommendations.
The only change is all the acronyms were spelled out. And that
no, there was language removed about the traditional and ecological knowledge and nature-based solutions, and so just highlighting that. Yeah. No, and that was from the March 10th meeting notes, which suggested combining that into the piece that's specifically about that. So the discussion that took place in Ag and Eco is to try and weave that language throughout all our recommendations. It didn't actually happen, but there was a broad discussion about like offering that alternative perspective in all the things that we're trying to do, you know, looking at nature-based solutions and traditional ecological knowledge throughout all those kind of working lands recommendations.
Got it. Okay. All right. I wonder, JL, if it's, given where we are right now, if you're okay with these going out as they are, and then circling back on that when we come back to May and being like, hey, have we woven this all together appropriately? If that's all right.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
I guess want the public to be aware that that was kind of the intent of that came out of the Ag and Eco Subcommittee, was to have that language present throughout.
Great. Okay. Okay. I wonder if we can make a little note somewhere in the whole packet of Ag and Eco where we put something on top of that to say that was an intent. Okay. Anything else, counselors? Because I even though we're a little late, there is an imperative to either set another meeting or you all give it the green light for us to make this punch list that I showed on my screen and get this out the door this week for our public meetings that start the end of next week. Any other concerns about getting this out the door? Okay. Which is amazing. Thank you, because it means that you have agreed on getting a draft out the door with some significant caveats attached. So I do want to applaud you, and I apologize that we're running late like this. Kelly, anything else?
A question to make sure we're all aware. At our March 10th meeting, we had discussed also including just the introductory chapters that were ready, that people felt comfortable putting out as part of the packet. Is that still the plan? And if so, have all the authors been checked with to make sure they're comfortable with that?
The reason Jane's shaking her head no is that when we look at what we have right now, we think the introductory chapters would benefit from some more back and forth.
I meant just the wraparound ones we talked about that are not with, so like the just transition one and the science and data one and whatever.
Correct. That those are not ready for this week going out.
Okay. All right. The Just Transition Subcommittee did greenlight letting that be part of what we send out. So we can include that if it's not weird to have chapter and then a bunch of things.
Okay.
So
maybe that's something to work with Jane on to see if we can get that up on the website.
Sounds good.
Okay. Joey?
Just lastly, process on, we talked about a cross-cutting financing recommendation, which we didn't get to today because we got to a lot of other things.
Yeah.
But I just want to put that back on the table. There's been a lot of great work that's been done in this arena through the Treasurer's Office and ANR and others in terms of the resilience implementation strategy. It just feels like financing is part of how we're going to support the transition in the most cost-effective and equitable manner. Seems important.
And you know, we've thrown it in the document right now. This is something that Joey pulled together with some other eyes on it. And I apologize throwing it at you right now. We could either include it or not include it in the packet that goes out publicly. I'd be interested if anybody feels strongly one way or the other to include it or not include it. Regardless, it'll be part of what you all start to work on into May as you finalize it. This is what Joey's put together for initial language on this. If folks want to just take a minute and look at it. Kelly?
We talked about maybe not including specific non-state organizations, and I feel like some of these are not, but I'm not sure. Like naming specific, I think saying credit unions is great, right? So just
right. So take out, we did that work of taking out the non-state specific organizations. Yeah. So we could do that here too.
Have
Any
one-
other quick reactions? And if folks are feeling uncomfortable, like, hey, David, let's not include this in what goes out now because we need more time, that's fine too.
I think this looks good. I would just have one very minor specific suggestion, which is to say Vermont efficiency and distribution utilities rather than just Vermont distribution utilities in the final.
Great. Anybody feel very strongly that this shouldn't go out as part of the draft? We can make those two changes to it, Secretary Clark.
I just wanted to say it looks like it's directing folks to explore opportunities. Which seems like a useful endeavor as opposed to committing us to something other than exploring the opportunities. That's the key language that I'm looking at.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Thanks, Secretary Clark. Okay. Not hearing a lot of concern or any concern about including, and we will remove the specific orgs, and we can make that change that Jared said about distribution and efficiency utilities. Okay. All right, folks, we're getting to the end of our meeting. We didn't get an update from Jane on the modeling, on the modeling. I'm wondering, Jane, if you want to do that in a quick note, a written note to the council as a follow-up. And the last thing is April meetings. With the steering committee, we talked about the likelihood that we actually do need to meet in April and start looking at some of this text. We have actually already thrown on your calendar a meeting on Monday, the 14th. We know there is a public engagement meeting that night, so it might be a double whammy for some of you, but it seemed like the one time that might make sense for everyone. So barring a great concern from you all, we're going to meet on the 14th and use that time to look at a lot of this text and other things that we haven't had a chance to look at. And we're going to use that time to do a land acknowledgement update process. If you remember what we did last time with Judy, where she did a very powerful thing where you all like went outside and experienced the land and then came back and collectively wrote some thoughts. We're going to update that process. So that should happen on the 14th as well. So that's just a heads up. What else? I think that's else. Jane, did Jane run away? Oh, no, she's there. Jane, am I forgetting anything?
I was just hiding under the table, sorry.
Yeah.
I'll send an update on the modeling as well.
Thank you. Okay. Counselors, anything before we wind up? And I appreciate your extra time today. This was quite a slog. Anything before we wind up here? Okay. Thanks for the extra time. Thanks for being, creative and thoughtful and how to move forward on some of these difficult issues and get some draft content out there so we can get public reaction. We look forward to seeing you at the public engagement sessions. You all signed up. Thank you. If you haven't signed up already, reach out to me, Jane, Sophie, and we'll make sure you get to the closest one for you. Thanks, everyone. Expect notes and updated versions, and we'll see you out there in some of these meetings.
David, thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.